On the Gary Bisbee Show, here are practical lessons from today's healthcare insiders. We'll uncover stories about their challenges, paths to success, and the skills that they've developed, as together we'll explore how the healthcare economy is transforming. Dr. Kaveh Safavi is an exceptionally engaging and knowledgeable healthcare aficionado. As the Senior Managing Director and head of the global healthcare practice, I've always found Kaveh's worldview to be incredibly useful. I asked Kaveh about advice for early stage leaders, and he summarized as follows: become an expert listener, read extensively, and practice understanding where the individual is coming from. During our discussion about healthcare moving to a consumer or customer focus, Kaveh outlined his views of why we should be thinking about the person rather than the more transactional terms of customer and consumer. We dug into personalization of healthcare, and he observed that there are two arms of that dialogue: experiential and biological. Each arm is on a unique path, and Kaveh shared the pace of change, challenges, and opportunities of each. Privacy is growing as a factor, and Kaveh indicated that the U.S. should be studying Europe and may have to catch up to Europe in the broader concept of data protection. We wrapped up with a very interesting discussion of how larger new entrants to healthcare will need to proceed. Let's move now to the conversation with Dr. Kaveh Safavi. Good afternoon, Kaveh, and welcome.
Hi, Gary. Great to be here with you.
We're pleased to have you at the microphone. Kaveh, as you know, we've spent a lot of time thinking about leadership and lessons of leadership and so on. I'd love to ask you some questions about that just to get your feeling. Why don't we kick off with looking back on your career? What have been the major leadership lessons that you've learned?
I think they keep evolving. I don't think I'm done yet, but I would say that increasingly the value of understanding that you need to listen to understand, something that for me is a continuous work in progress. I think another critical one is the idea that you have to teach people as opposed to telling people things, because if people understand why, it's much easier for them to make decisions for themselves and to act. I think it's also really important for a leader to role model the behaviors that they are talking about. You know, you have to really, there is a walk the walk kind of a aspect to leadership that's pretty critical. I think another thing that I'm learning very clearly is that you have to have clarity about who owns what decisions, concepts of decision rights. Things really slow down if people don't know what decisions are theirs and what decisions are someone else's. Those are that's a good list to start with of things I've learned over the last, say, 40 years.
How would the young Kaveh have thought about leadership?
The young Kaveh, good question. I wonder, the young Kaveh was probably a cross between young Sheldon and Alex Keaton, some version of that. I think I was a pretty, I was an enthusiastic learner, but I wasn't really driven by the goal of being in charge or telling people what to do, which led me to have a lot of curiosity and to ask a lot of questions. And sometimes that actually resulted in people saying, "Hey, you seem to talk a lot. Why don't you take this over?" That was a valuable lesson I learned, which is if you speak up, you're probably going to earn a position, which is a positive or negative. But it didn't come from a desire to be in control of anything. It came from a desire to learn and to participate. I think that listening before speaking has been a skill that I've evolved over time. So my ratio of speaking to listening was inverted, more speaking, not enough listening early in my career, and it's rotating the other direction as I get older.
You've mentioned listening several times. Are there any particular tricks or strategies that you use to listen more or learn more from listening?
So a few things. One of them is that it's a conscious decision. It doesn't come by accident, particularly if you're playing a talk track in your head at the same time. So you have to really force yourself. I think the other one is the deliberate decision to not formulate a response until you fully understand where the other person is coming from. And particularly in areas that you have a fair amount of knowledge about, there's a natural tendency to run ahead. And so resisting that natural tendency and really stopping to listen is important. It's actually easier to listen in a field that you don't know much about because you really don't have anything to say, so you're in full absorption mode. It becomes much harder to have that kind of a conversation with someone where you know maybe as much or even more about a subject than they do, to be able to listen carefully. I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is I'm spending more time seeking to understand where that person is coming from as opposed to what they're saying. And that's another really important skill, is recognizing that people's perspective or point of view is often informed by their own personal sense of where they are in the world or what role they play, as well as some facts and whatever their orthodoxy might be. So trying to understand where they're coming from and why exactly they're taking this position or saying this is another important part of listening. And it means you got to listen through kind of the first order of conversation to the second order conversation.
Would you share with us a bit about your parents and in particular how they influenced your leadership style?
So my parents had a huge influence on me. I was very lucky. Sometimes luck and who you're born, family you're born into matters a lot. Both very intellectually curious, both scientific types, and as a result, strong encouragement to understand complexity and nuance without oversimplifying things too much. They were both very optimistic, so the glass was, for the most part, half full for both of them, both my mother and father. My father in particular really encouraged debate, and he encouraged rhetorical argument. And his whole theory was that would make us better thinkers. So as a young child, this is a experience that I will never forget this. As a very young child, it was Christmas, and we were really excited about Santa Claus. And my brother and I was a year younger. My father decided this was going to be a good time to learn a lesson. And so he immediately launched into a debate with us about why Santa Claus doesn't exist. And he, in order to force us to make the argument about why Santa Claus existed. And as soon as we got to a certain place, he reversed his position and made us argue the other side. And later in life, he told us how intentional he was about that, which was his whole theory was that we needed to understand how to make an argument, and that he was going to use this as an opportunity to teach us how to do that.
Just to wrap up this particular section, many of our audience are up-and-coming leaders, I would say, relatively early stage leaders. What advice do you give somebody who's earlier stage in their leading about leadership, Kaveh?
Well, in addition to the things I talked about before, I think there's a few other things that really matter. I think you need to start really trying to understand what's important to you early on. And that's hard, and it evolves over time. But for example, recognizing early on that title and positional authority wasn't what motivated me, but intellectual curiosity motivated me more, helped me to make decisions about how I would approach certain things, maybe what kind of opportunities I would take. It would cause me to make career decisions, to take on things that I really wasn't qualified to do, because it was an opportunity to learn something that was just interesting and curious. Another big one is the benefit of taking meetings and meeting with as many people as you can. There's a natural tendency, I think, for people to focus on their task, and everyone is coming at you. Particularly, you might be in some position where people want to sell you things all the time, or people want to pitch you ideas, and it's easy to put up the protective shield and try to keep people out to do the work. I learned very early on, actually, from my father, who was a scientist, but he was also a salesman, and he was a gifted natural salesman, that this idea of interacting with people is pretty critical. And so I was on the opposite, which is anybody who wanted to meet with me, I figured out how to meet with them. I didn't put any real filter up. And I was genuinely interested, not for a transactional reason, but just because I was just interested in getting to know people. And I realized you can learn something from every conversation and from every person. You could also make a lot of professional friends. And it turned out, indirectly, if you sort of follow the Adam Grant kind of givers and takers, all this stuff pays itself forward in different ways. So That part of it, I think, was really important. And then the last one is the value of reading. From a superpower perspective, I think the thing that's really helped me be particularly successful is that I just read a lot. And as a result of that, my fact base is bigger than just listening to a conversation and repeating it. And over time, the value of reading has just continuously been amplified. So I encourage people to find time to read. And I don't mean, you don't have to read one domain, but it really expands your thinking. So I put that on the list too.
Why don't we move to what some are calling personalization in healthcare, consumerization, putting the person at the center. And as well as anybody, given your background as a physician and a lawyer, that we haven't been really very good at that in healthcare. But what terms come to your mind? Do you use the term customer or consumer or person? How do you describe this? Let's get the person at the center.
Well, we have actively, when I say we, I reflect both me as well as my colleagues at Accenture, have actively moved away from using language of customer or consumer for healthcare and focusing more on people or person, in part because customer or consumer has a relatively transactional notion to it. And we're trying to describe a relationship with a human being as opposed to a transaction. I go back to something that was really influential in my thinking about this. Probably 2004 or 5 at IHI, Don Berwick gave a talk, and he posed a rhetorical question, which I think is still fabulous. And since that time, Don and I have actually had a conversation about this a couple of times. But he said that when a physician visits a patient in a hospital, is the patient a guest in our facility, or are we a guest in the patient's life? Who's visiting whom? Because if we're guests in their lives, which is one way to think about it, are we being very good guests? And the interesting thing is to convert the physical metaphor, which is you're a patient in the bed, to the therapeutic metaphor, which is I'm a guest in your life to help you, so I need to think about myself that way, is a really interesting distinction and in some ways contradiction. And I would say that the challenge has been that we've been caught up in the physical manifestation of that relationship as opposed to the trust-based manifestation of that relationship. And it goes to your issue, Gary, which is that the narrative around person-centric and patient-centered care, I'm not sure it's really been about putting the person at the center, because in my mind, if the person is at the center, then they're in control of the interaction, and they get to make the decisions about whether or not things happen or don't happen. And I would argue that a lot of what we do that in the name of being patient-centered is still provider-centered or delivery system-centric. It's just increasing levels of permission. So it's a lot like, I always say, it's like taking my dog out for a walk and giving the dog more leash to create the illusion that the dog is in control, but I'm still holding the leash and it's still on the dog's neck. That hasn't been reversed. And so the truth of the matter is that we've really been giving patients more leash, but we haven't really given control over. However, I think that a variety of forces in society, both the ability as well as the motivation, are all conspiring to reverse that polarity. And therein lies both a threat and an opportunity.
Yeah, what do you think about data in particular? There's so much more data that individuals have now about themselves and about their conditions and medical care and so on, that it's putting them in a position where they just are more able, if they want to make the decision, or if not make the decision, at least influence it. How do you think about that, Kaveh?
I think that there's two separate arms to this. So there's an aspect of our recognition, it's just a kind of a Maslow's hierarchy, right? That we all have a greater sense that our desire to actualize ourselves in healthcare, the healthcare experience is just part of that, is part of our psyche. And I think that the realization that people's ability to know us and understand us is heightened creates expectations like I would expect that you would be able to do a better job of personalizing this care or this experience for me. But in no way, shape, or form are people giving up the right to have control over their own information. So the expectation is still that this is my information. It's not your information. It's my information. And I'll decide when and where you can use that information. And my expectation is that you use it correctly. There was I don't know if you saw this most recent Harvard Business Review had a really interesting article about how loyalty programs can backfire. And with the idea that if I join a loyalty program and now you have data about me and you do something that clearly demonstrates that you didn't use it, that's worse than not having a program at all. And I think there's the same kind of issue here with a hospital. If I go to a health system where I've been going there, for my whole life and they keep asking me the same questions, that's worse than if I'd never been there before and they asked me those questions. And so I think that expectation is there, and because we know the information, it is possible for that to happen. That being said, I think that the patients also recognize as a patient, in the role of patient, that they won't be able to make all the decisions for themselves, and they are going to be having to trust the delivery system. They'll delegate to the delivery system certain kinds of tasks. I often describe a patient that is sitting in a hospital bed, and I'm going to use the word patient because this is an actual ill person in a hospital bed. That person is a patient, and they're also a consumer, and they're also a citizen and a relative all at the same time. And every one of those personas is simultaneously interacting. So they might be deeply deferential to the clinical staff around the lab tests, but they have a totally different perspective around their ability to control their environment, which might include scheduling things and when they're going to leave the room and who's going to know if they're in the room and all those sorts of things. So you have to be cognizant of all of that moving around at the same time.
Well, let's talk about perception of illness for a moment, where if you're in a hospital bed, almost by definition, there's going to be some decisions made that you really can't make. You don't have the capacity or the information to make them. But if you're not in a hospital and you're making a decision that you don't perceive as really being that much affecting illness in the sense, then you're probably more willing and interested in making that decision yourself. Does that make sense to you, Kaveh?
Yeah, I think that, from a framework perspective, you delegate certain decisions based on its complexity or your capacity, and everybody has a different point at which they make the decision. Some people will delegate to their clinicians, some people will delegate to their relatives, some people won't delegate at all, and we have to be cognizant of the fact that we as human beings all have a different way of thinking about that. It's actually something I learned because I'm an internal medicine and a pediatrics doc, and it was fascinating to me early in my career to see the contrast. Because internists basically just treat patients. And it doesn't even make any sense because many of these patients really don't have the mental capacity to make the decisions. Whereas pediatricians almost always treat families and parents as much as they treat children. So as a pediatrician, I realized that I have a patient, which is the child, but I also have a patient's family, and every conversation included the family members. And what was so interesting when I would make hospital rounds was that it didn't matter on the adult wards, and even as an attending physician, every day after I saw a patient, I made sure I called whoever was the caregiver for that family member. And I didn't do it because I stopped and thought about it in some strategic consumer sort of a sense. It just felt like that's a natural thing. I know that this 90-year-old person has somebody else who's their caregiver that I need to have a conversation with because this person isn't in a position to do that. And it was fascinating to me how my peers who didn't have that similar training experience, didn't have that as a natural part of their consciousness.
Industry, increasingly, you're seeing a position of chief customer experience officer, which we don't see that much in healthcare, at least that I'm aware of. Is that something that you think will become more popular in our health systems or possibly even health plans?
Well, we are seeing experience. I'm seeing more larger organizations think about experience officers. Some of them are taking a slightly different angle, a technology angle to it, thinking about digital. And some of them realize that once you create that, it doesn't make any sense because experience is everywhere. So I think we're going through an organizational evolution where we're trying to decide, and this is really about adoption. If we're going from not really having skills to having skills, there is the one our organizational objective is that you want it to be someone's job until you realize it's everyone's job. But the evolution of that requires a certain level of attention. So the best examples I find are leaders who come in realizing that their primary objective is to create capabilities and then to catalyze the diffusion of those capabilities into the organization, rather than to somehow be in control of a part of the business, because there's no logical way to reorganize around something like experience that needs to be present everywhere at every touch point.
You know, Drucker said a business purpose is to create a customer. How do you think about that in relation to a large health system today?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, because one could argue that that narrative sort of works in healthcare and sort of doesn't. At a competitive level, it makes sense because you're trying to build loyalty. But there is also the broader notion, which is that the purpose of the healthcare system, if we executed ourselves perfectly, is to not have customers because people would be well or be able to care for themselves. I mean, you go back and look at the Mayo brothers at the founding of the Mayo Clinic, and one of the concepts from one of the brothers was that the purpose of medicine was to eliminate the need for a doctor. And his concept was that essentially given what doctors could do back 125 years ago, which wasn't much, a pill that could actually treat a condition was a way better answer than seeing a doctor who didn't know what they were doing. And so I think in a sense, fast forward that today, and I think about if I'm sick and I wake up, or my kids are sick and they wake up, I don't wake up and go, you know what I want to do today more than anything is to see the healthcare system. What I really want to do is to be better. Now, if the path to being better requires me to go through a healthcare system, fantastic. But that's my goal isn't to have a relationship with the healthcare system. My goal is to get to a physical outcome. And so I do believe that we as healthcare providers need to recognize the fact that the long game is to minimize the amount of time people need to deal with us. However, we also want to be in a situation where if someone needs care, we want to be the place that they would prefer to go to because of the nature of the experience and the nature of the quality of the outcomes they're going to get. So I think we have to hold both of those concepts in our mind at the same time.
Let's turn for a moment to digitization and scientific innovation. We've seen a lot of increase, obviously, since the HITECH Act in digitizing medical care. That's having consequence to create substantially more data, both for the consumer and for the provider. How do you think about precision medicine and all the precision medicine strategies that collect enormous amounts of data around a particular condition? Are you thinking over the course of, let's say, this decade, that that's going to really make a difference in quality and the type of care that can be delivered?
Yes, I think there's two arms to that dialogue. There's what I'll call the biological arm, and then there's the experiential arm. So if you focus on the biological arm, lots of energy being put against it. Feels like oncology clearly evolving to a place where no two people with the same disease are treated the same way, especially as we understand how the interaction of the immune system with the underlying cellular drivers of cancer interact, so that you really do have to understand that person in order to create a therapy. And other immune diseases or immune-mediated diseases increasingly become more personalized. So my expectation is that path just keeps on going. And our ability to understand which patient's physiology responds to drugs and all those sorts of things will keep evolving. So clearly more. I don't think there's an end state to that, but I think that we make progress. I think that the more interesting one is superimposed on that is the concept of personalizing an experience separate from the biology. And that's one where we are going to be able to borrow lessons learned from outside of healthcare and other industries, other services and product industries, which have already recognized that that you need to think about your customers much more individually. As Gary, you described in your book, N=1, markets of one. Healthcare is about the most perfect example of a market of one. The biology alone makes you a market of one. But then you superimpose whatever your individual preferences are, and the probability that two people want the exact same care experience is zero. But the ability to personalize it requires two arms. The first arm is I need to know you in a way that is very context specific. And that has not only understanding your illness and your preferences, but there's a time series attached to that. But even if I do, the experience is still very monolithic unless I can figure out how to give elements of it that you can give you some level of control and give some level of variability, which is one of the reasons why I think not just digital data, but digital platforms and software are so critical to this conversation, because it allows us to convert the care experience into a blended physical and digital one. And it is that blending that allows us to create hyper-personalized experience in addition to the personalization of the biology, which will come from the clinical data part of it. So both of those are going on at the same time.
So more data means more issues with ownership and privacy, I'm sure. COVID, if you think about privacy in terms of vaccine, report cards and taking tests and tracking and so on, how do you think that all of this experience with COVID will influence how we think about privacy going forward?
Well, I think COVID comes on top of an already prolific privacy debate around our data that's in social platforms and other places. So what it does is it really amplifies the dialogue by demonstrating the fact that information about our physical status, for example, is ubiquitous, and that it is quite possible for people to have information about us unless we say no. So if you think about what happened in the very early days of contact tracing, right? The smartphone guys put applications in that gave phone location information. And interestingly enough, if you follow the history of contact tracing, the amount of digitization and automation is relatively limited because people did not want to passively allow that information to be available. So just because it was technically permissible didn't mean that people were okay with it. People were very careful about the information they wanted to opt in at. And that shows you how much respect we have to have for individuals' ideas about their data and who has the right to it and under what circumstances. So I think all COVID did, it just amplified the fact that, and particularly things like your phone, there's so much more data and everybody has it. And if we don't have conditions placed around it, people are going to use it. And I'm not exactly sure how they're going to use it. So the debate just gets more intense. It doesn't. It's not a new debate. It's just a more intense debate.
In terms of medical care, in terms of using data for clinical purposes, how do you see the ownership issue of particularly clinical data?
Well, I think this is, from a policy perspective, it's fairly settled in the sense that the actual the data, the content, is really owned by the person. Now, the challenge, of course, is that the data resides in a digital expression in different people's asset bases. And oftentimes people confuse the storage of the data with the intrinsic intellectual knowledge that's sitting at the data level. But I think we've, as a matter of every country, we've basically set down basic policy rubric that's pretty clear the data belongs to the person. I think the US is probably going to have to catch up to Europe in the broader concept of data protection, broader than just the concept of data privacy. Concepts like the right to be forgotten are pretty important. Where I think this really plays itself out in healthcare is that, for the most part, the way we manage, let's call it consent, the right to use my information, has historically been at the document or the record level or physical paper level. But the fact that we are digitizing individual discrete data elements means that if we're really going to honor people's intent, we have to actually manage that consent at the data element level, not at the document level, or not at the visit level, but really at the level of every value, every code, and the idea that, because all those pieces just keep finding their way into other things. The file, the claim file, the EMR file gets used and reused and reused. And if I want to be forgotten, I have to be able to go find that element everywhere. And that's not a record. That is a specific data element. So there is a lot of advances going on right now around the technology necessary to create essentially a consent identity at every single element that's in a record, as opposed to at the record level. But that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem is managing that consent process. Because if the idea was that I was a researcher, or I was a app developer and that I have a value proposition for you, and it might be advancing scientific research or it might be building a product that makes your life better, I need to gain your consent. Well, how am I going to do that? If I send an email to you and ask you for your consent, that's never going to happen. And we all know that, right? And you won't even know how to answer that. And so increasingly, there's a whole discussion about who are these intermediaries. Some people call them consent brokers. These are trusted entities by the person whose data that's coming, that essentially engages in a relationship with you where you continuously specify the conditions under which you want your information to be made available for others. And then people who want that information essentially come to the consent intermediary to find out if they can get information and what kinds of information. And that's a three-party relationship. But I think, right now people are trying to figure out who that entity is. Outside the US, you're seeing mostly people thinking about government or quasi-governmental agencies because they're trusted. I think people, generally speaking, don't trust the tech companies to take that role in. At least the current level of trust doesn't really fit that. Our research on who you trust with your data clinically puts the tech companies at the farthest away end of the spectrum. The providers are at the closest end of the spectrum. But that's going to be another interesting area, is even if I can technically manage it, procedurally, how do I manage this? And so both of those are becoming evolving fields now. Both of them are necessary to gain the real benefits of this information.
So we talked about providers on one end, tech companies on the other. Where do the retail companies like CVS and Walmart and Walgreens fit?
Well, from a source of data, they are if they have a provider posture, then they're following the provider path. They might also have information about you that come from your buying behaviors, which are interesting and useful, and they have their own rubric. They don't necessarily have the same rubric as patient data does, and that's a matter of public policy as to whether or not we want to consider your retail information to be something that's as protected as your clinical information. But to some extent, they're a source of data. They're also potentially a user of the data if they want to build products and services. And just like any other user of data, they're going to have to honor that. So, which is one of the reasons why, if you look at retailers who have had clinics, they have been unable, from a policy perspective, to merge front of store retail behavior and the pharmacy and the clinical PHI data together as a matter of policy. Sure, they have record systems and they contain them, but they don't have a policy right to integrate that information without going through the right kinds of consents. So, I think they're just like everybody else in that they have to figure out how to create a value proposition. I think the other thing that's really important, and we're seeing this increasingly, going back to this issue of consent, is that people want to understand how the information is going to be used in plain English. And there was a fascinating study, it was done probably a decade ago, and it was looking at patients' willingness to have their information used either for marketing or for clinical trials. And what they discovered in this research was that in general, people are okay if their information is used for clinical trials, whether they explicitly consent to it or not. And they're actually not okay if it's used for marketing back to them, even if they consented to it, which goes to show you people don't even understand the blanket consents they're signing. So it's more of a policy perspective. The gray zone that we've been struggling with is, like with COVID, for example, you see lots of people volunteering, not just their data, but physically volunteering to be infected by the virus for the benefit of humanity. I think we have it is not outside of the realm of human beings to want to participate in making better medicines. What we get into is this gray area of commercial products that someone might economically benefit from that isn't necessarily me. And if a product manufacturer, a digital product manufacturer says, hey, give me all your data and I'm going to make a product that helps people with diabetes or smoking or anxiety or depression or whatever the thing is, or makes your insurance experience better, you'd go, well, okay, I'm willing to have a conversation, but let me ask you something. What's in it for me? Now, they're not just turning it over to you unconditionally. They're saying, I'm willing to turn it over to you, but I need something in return for that. That value exchange has to be dealt with somehow. So it's not a yes, it's not a no, but it's a gray zone. And I think we're going to both recognizing it, figuring out the value, and then figuring out how to execute the value exchange is something that we're going to make progress on in the next few years, and that will help open up more opportunities too.
Kaveh, this has been a terrific interview, as expected, I might add. Let's wrap up with one final question, and you've alluded to it several points during this discussion, but let me ask it directly. What do you think the single biggest issue the healthcare system is going to address in this decade is?
I think it's people's expectations of how healthcare should be are being formulated by their perceptions and experiences out of healthcare, and the gap between how it is and how it should be is just getting bigger. And that gap is going to get filled. And it's either going to get filled by regulation or it's going to get filled by businesses that solve that problem. And that those could be the incumbents, healthcare providers and payers and others, or it could be new entrants who realize that closing that expectation is a business opportunity. So the widening of the expectation gap and then the narrowing of it and the filling of it is really going to be where a lot of the action is going to be. And I think for the incumbent healthcare delivery system and payers, this is a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous risk, but it's all fundamentally driven by people's expectations and the fact that we're not meeting those expectations and people aren't standing for it and they're going to look for some kind of a solution, some kind of a way around it.
So put in simple terms, expectations of having Amazon deliver a package the same day you order it versus waiting for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days for a physician's appointment. Is that an example of that expectation?
Yeah, that's a simple one. I mean, I think people want everything from, I gave you my information, how is it you don't know about me? Why can't I pay this bill? Why is the insurance process so chaotic? Why is it that I have a network, an insurance product network, and nobody can tell me anything about who takes my insurance or who's open when I know all this information is available? I think it's got that level of dimensionality to it. I think that we have a very fragmented delivery system, and people just know it can be better. Some of it will be everything from why is it that I don't know who the good doctors are?
Yep.
Why is that so hard to find out? That's an interesting one because that's not just an experiential one. There's also a clinical piece that goes into that because what does it mean to be a good doctor and how do you communicate that is really important. So I think that the totality of the fact that healthcare just isn't like everything else is what drives this. So I think it would be overly simplistic to just focus on some of the basic, simple complexities. Some of these things are going to be too hard for non-healthcare companies to solve for, which is why regulation is going to step in and solve it. Think about price transparency as an example. That's a classic example of the market failing to meet people's expectations. And at the end of the day, the burden is put on the actors to solve that problem.
Kaveh, well said. Good place to land. We really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Gary. Look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon.